Hello, Ivy here. This week's podcast is entitled What Survivors Need and What Institutions Keep Missing. SGUK, episode 171. Introduction. At the heart of the forthcoming book, my forthcoming book, proudly want to say, is the recognition that Megan Sussex, despite her global platform and resources, has endured relentless psychological warfare and coercive control since 2016, causing her and Prince Harry to leave not only the institution of monarchy, but an entire continent. If such treatment can be directed at a woman with visibility and support, the implications for women and children without resources are devastating. Every day, countless survivors and victims face coercive behaviour in their homes, workplaces, and communities. Many are under the age of 18, and far too many are no longer with us. This research demonstrates that coercive control is not new. While the legal term was only formalised in recent years, the evidence of such abuse stretches back centuries. By documenting Megan's treatment alongside historical and legal case studies, the forthcoming book brings global attention to a continuum of abuse and argues for urgent reform. Its aim is not only literary contribution, but also to spark dialogue within national and international law about how coercive control can be better recognised and prevented. Here is an extract. There are a few coming up in this podcast from survivors and consultants, and many more, as you will see in the reference sources listed at the end of this article. Our first quote. Situated historically, the See the Signs campaign can be read as the culmination of decades of theorising about coercive control, commonly defined as a course of conduct aimed dominating and controlling another, usually an intimate partner, but it can be other family members, and is almost exclusively perpetrated by men against women. Two theories of coercive control emerged as part of a wider knowledge production about domestic violence from the 1970s onwards, including via victims and survivors sharing details of their experiences, and from the other direction, from men's counselling and behavioural change programmes. It was not until this century, however, that coercive control moved to the foreground of domestic violence discourse and policy, with the publication of what is widely considered to be the authoritative text, Coercive Control: How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life, open brackets, 2007, close brackets, by American forensic social worker and sociologist Evan Stark, and the introduction of the criminalization of coercive controlling behaviour in England and Wales in 2015, in Scotland in 2018, and Ireland in 2019. More specifically, the See the Signs campaign is one high-profile example of the entry of coercive control into the mainstream in Australia, following the murders of Hannah Clark and her 3 children, Elia, aged 6, 4-year-old Lena, and 3-year-old Trey, by her estranged husband, Rowan Baxter, in Brisbane, Queensland, in February 2020. For Dr. Evan Stark, and other formative theorists which you will come across over the next 6 weeks, the ongoing failures of health, criminal justice, and social services institutions to assist any battered woman, but especially those from low-income or minority backgrounds, were identified as part of the entrapment that defines coercive control. In his capacity as a forensic social worker who worked with incarcerated women who had been battered, sociologist Lee H. Bowker surveys of and interviews with battered women in the 1980s had similarly revealed that the majority were active agents in trying to make their environment safer, and moreover actively resisted their victimization. Dr. Stark took women's attempts at autonomy as the starting point from which the coercive control theory reframes battering relationships in terms of progressive entrapment, making the case for his alternative framework of coercive control as applicable to civil and criminal law cases and to any woman's circumstances, regardless of whether she met the Victorian standard of womanhood that informed the black women syndrome description. Stark further argued in 1995 that broadening the representation of women in court is only the first step in legal reform. By the end of the 1990s, theorising domestic violence through the lens of control had moved from the margins to the centre of research, though the primary focus on heterosexual relationships was identified as a continued limitation. Yet, the impact of this research on law, policy and services continued to be negligible, at least in the United States, where Stark continued to focus most of his attention in his 2007 book and its 2009 revised edition. As he had in 1995, Stark declared the domestic violence revolution had stalled, with little effect on coercive control, the most widespread and devastating strategy men use to dominate women in personal life. In the US and the UK, the core imagery of violence and victimization continued to guide law and policy, with non-violent forms of oppression quarantined to psychological abuse, itself most commonly understood as an effect of violence rather than a constitutive feature of abuse. Stark has since off-cited definition clearly marks it as distinctly gendered. Coercive control, wrote Dr. Stark, entails a malvolient coercive conduct that subordinates women to an alien will by violating their physical integrity, in brackets domestic violence, denying them respect and autonomy, in brackets intimidation, depriving them of social connectedness, in brackets isolation, and appropriating or denying them access to the resources required for personhood and citizenship, in brackets control. Let me repeat those words in brackets again, because they are going to come up a lot in discussions, and there are similar or additional, I would say, descriptions that will be appearing over the next 6 weeks. And as we go through this series, I think you will very quickly start to recognise many, if not all, of the ways that Meghan has been treated since 2016. And those items that are in brackets, and some that you will be hearing about in the coming weeks, you will see that every box is ticked in terms of what was done and continues to be done in some of those areas towards her, even though she's now on a different continent. But we'll come to that over the coming weeks. But as a start, bearing in mind that the majority of what we've sort of quickly gone through in this particular section, the majority of the professionals, the experts, were still, if you like, focusing on physical actions. Not to say there's anything wrong in that by itself, and for what what that covers, it is important. But coercive control is not about having physical marks that people can see and then decide upon what action should be taken against their abuser. And what Dr. Stark did from a very early stage in sort of the history of this, and in terms of writing books about it and doing more research, and then coming away with a new set, if you like, of descriptions, and gives it validity in terms of what has been going on for centuries, but was never referred to in the ways that we do it now. It was always included within the evidence of physical violence. So the things that we've had that were quoted in brackets today, and there will be more coming up, it's worth keeping in mind, because now the law has been updated and needs updating again, I have to say, but it's a start. We're getting somewhere. These descriptions you will come to know like the back of your hand, and you will understand when people are talking about one or more of those experiences that they've had to suffer in silence most of the time, because it was not seen as being anything for anyone to worry about. So, in fact, I'll read the few lines that surround those four, I think, in descriptions in brackets, where Dr. Stark said, entails a malvolient course of conduct that subordinates women to an alien will by violating their physical integrity, in brackets, domestic violence, close brackets, denying them respect and autonomy, in brackets, intimidation, close brackets, depriving them of social connectedness, in brackets, isolation, close brackets, and appropriating or denying them access to the resources required for personhood and citizenship, in brackets, control, close brackets. Dr. Stark's associated claim that nothing men experience in the normal course of their everyday lives resembles this conspicuous form of subjugation has been tested since, as have many other aspects of his theorizing, including the distinction he made between domestic violence and coercive control, that are beyond of the scope of this article to address. Until his death in March 2024, as I said, we sadly lost him last year, Dr. Stark was an active participant in coercive control theory, revising and adjusting some of his earlier arguments in dialogue with others, and in response to developments such as the criminalization of coercive control in various jurisdictions. While the US centricism of his framing of coercive control as a liberty crime has been widely noted, And while his theorising emerged from his activism and his forensic social work, it was in the United Kingdom where his work has had the most impact. If legislation is taken as the key indicator, his human rights framing has also arguably been better appreciated in Europe than in the United States. Our next section is headed up the non-physical behaviour model. Evan Stark's 2007 book, Coercive Control: How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life, is arguably the single most significant work marking the rise to prominence of coercive control in policy and practice. Stark sought to position coercive control as a liberty crime, defining it as a strategic course of oppressive conduct intended to intimidate, degrade, isolate, and control victims. Stark subdivides the tactics deployed by abusers into those relating to coercion, physical and sexual violence, intimidation, threats and degradation, and those relating to control, isolation, exploitation, and deprivation, micro-regulation of everyday behaviour. He suggests that while physical violence in the context of coercive control can be severe, it is more frequently less severe but repeated, and that there are significant minority of cases in which there will be no physical violence. This position is consistent with the Duluth model, which positions the threat of physical and sexual violence as framing and reinforcing the core non-physical behaviours of coercive control. And that is one of Dr. Stark's research papers and a book that was published in 2012. Details in the reference sources. Dr. Stark also, in that same publication in 2012, also suggests coercive control is a highly personalised form of domestic violence, with intimacy and proximity affording the perpetrator the opportunity to refine abusive tactics to target a victim's personal vulnerabilities. He suggests further that the abusive tactics employed in coercive control operate frequently through the lens of gender inequality, focusing on how women perform gender roles they inherit by default. In the article, and also obviously more detailed in the reference sources, you will see that each of these quotes from Dr. Stark give you the year and the page number of the report or book. Crucially then, coercive control presents an alternative to what Dr. Stark was saying in 2012 when he referred to the violent incident model. The theory recognises victim survivors' experiences of their abuse as continuous and multifaceted, as opposed to a series of discrete or time-bound acts of physical assault or psychological aggression. Kirkwood, another expert, in 1993 described a web of abuse where the components are interwoven in such a way that they comprise a whole which has properties beyond merely the sum of those individual components. Coercive control recognises that abuse can be a course of conduct, traversing time and space, rather than a time-bound incident or series of incidents of abusive acts. It recognises the range of abusive tactics and behaviours experienced by victims and acknowledges that for some, the harm associated with multiple non-physical abusive behaviours is more severe than the harm inflicted by discrete physical assaults. It is a theory born out of advocacy and support work with female victims and survivors, and thus reflects their lived experiences of domestic violence. Legislation lagging behind social reality. An impact of the most recent ONS figures, which show that there were only 235 successful coercive control prosecutions last year, in the context of an estimated 1.3 million women who experienced domestic abuse. However, a new paper in the Howard Journal of Crime and Justice suggests that the picture on the ground is more complicated. It also argues that urgent training is needed if Section 76 is to reach its undoubtedly progressive potential. Analysis of data from interviews and focus groups with survivors, their closest advisors, and police shows that Section 76 has the potential to change the way the criminal justice system deals with domestic abuse radically and for the better. This will only be possible, however, if police, CPS, and the judiciary are trained to understand the dynamics of coercive control. Last year, the World Health Organization declared that domestic abuse is an international emergency. An approach to the prosecution of domestic abuse that is informed by the theory of coercive control could help keep women safe. Change is needed. Rhetorical intent in the context of domestic abuse is a good start. Compulsory training in coercive control for all key criminal justice agents would help make this intent an operational success story. Why the UK criminalised coercive control abusive behaviour. Coercive control is the label domestic abuse experts give to the experience that Curtis, a 38-year-old safety specialist on the UK's railways, endured. It encompasses a series of non-physical behaviours, including threats, humiliation, monitoring and isolation from friends and family, that they say can be just as damaging as physical violence, often causing severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. In 2015, England and Wales became the first nations in the world to criminalise such controlling behaviour within relationships, making coercive control punishable by up to 5 years in jail. Women make up 95% of those who experience coercive control, and 74% of perpetrators are men, according to a study by one UK police force. Curtis began taking notes about the abuse, saving text messages, phone records, and even filming her husband's outbursts. She left him last June, and in October he was sentenced to 2 years in prison after pleading guilty to a charge of coercive control. Her case marks an early victory for England and Wales legislation. For decades, law enforcement agencies worldwide have seen domestic abuse almost exclusively in physical terms, measuring its severity in individual beatings and injuries. The 1994 Federal Violence Against Women Act in the US, for example, criminalizes only felony or misdemeanor crimes of violence in domestic contexts. In this corner of the world, though, policymakers are trying something new. Ireland and Scotland followed England and Wales with their own coercive control laws in January and April of this year. By criminalising behaviours many previously considered merely unpleasant, domestic abuse advocates hope these laws will transform how society views acceptable power dynamics in relationships and how we tackle abuse. We're beginning to understand that it isn't about one-off incidents. Abuse is a pattern, a war of attrition that wears a person down, says Laura Richards, a British criminal behavioural analyst who helped pass the 2015 law after nearly 2 decades working in the domestic abuse sector. Coercive control is the very heart of it. And some of you will know that I have done a number of podcasts, but 2 in particular in quite a lot of detail about Laura Richards' work, and she features in the book that's coming out over the next few months. A highly respected individual, really, really good. How silence, shame, and respectability politics uphold abuse. This is an extract from A Survivor, and the article was written in 2016. The publication no longer exists. However, the article is so powerful, I have included a part of it here. It's still, this particular section that I'm quoting from and the article that it comes from is still on the internet. It's still on the website of a publication. It's very powerful. I highly recommend that you make a point at some stage to read all of that report. That publication, even though it's no longer in existence, has left behind certain articles. Clearly, what they're saying is these are too important to just remove because that publication no longer is around. They've left them there, and this is one of them, and this is a short extract from one of them, which to me, the fact that the publication left it there speaks volumes. They've not left everything behind. There are certain articles that they've left there for people to see and hopefully learn from. The extract. It's a problem of epidemic proportions because it has an impact on all of us. What makes it silent is our inability or unwillingness to talk openly about shame and explore the ways in which it affects our individual lives, our families, our communities, and society. Our silence has actually forced shame underground, where it now permeates our personal and public lives in destructive and insidious ways. 4 years ago, I graduated from Rutgers University with a master's degree in art history. I was surrounded on that sunny day by my family, including my fiancée and my soon-to-be stepdaughter. I was one of the first kids in my family to go to college, and this felt like my greatest accomplishment yet. But when I look at photos from that day, my fiancée's daughter grinning and wearing my mortarboard, my father standing gravely with a bouquet of flowers. I felt not pride or nostalgia, but shame. Several months later, I would shove as many things as I could carry into a large plastic trash bags, grab my cat, get into a car with my mother, only returning to that house once, briefly, in order to pick up the rest of my things. But even though I got out, the shame lingers, poisoning even my happy memories. Like many survivors of abuse, I wonder, did I put up with it for too long? Was it somehow my fault? In her book, I thought I was just me, but it isn't. I thought it was just me, but it isn't. Author and speaker Brené Brown calls shame a silent epidemic. Brown says that shame needs three things to grow exponentially: secrecy, silence, and judgment. It's no wonder then that people who have endured abuse at the hands of an intimate partner are so likely to feel ashamed about it. Abusers thrive on secrecy, silence, and judgment. They rely on planting the very feelings that nourish shame. She said her ex-fiancé was a master gaslighter, which is to say that he thoroughly manipulated me into questioning my own sanity and perception of reality in the course of our relationship. He was adept at making me believe the problems in our relationship were my fault. He went to great lengths to distance me from family and friends, so that the only support that I perceived for myself was him. He made me feel small. He made me feel useless. This, in turn, made me feel ashamed, and that shame did his work for him. Shame made me doubt myself. It tricked me into believing that everything he said about me was true. Once he began nurturing an environment that encouraged shame, I was less likely to put up a fight. For the last 9 months of our relationship, I thought daily about leaving, but was held in place by paralyzing fear of what other people would think of me should I break off the engagement. Coupled with the bond that I had formed with my stepdaughter, that fear kept me nailed in place throughout the summer that followed our engagement. After I left my fiancé and his daughter, I did not stay at my parents' house. I preferred to couch surf rather than grapple with the fallout of that relationship in front of the people who loved me. Eventually, shame drove me into a shell of a home that a friend had purchased with the intent of renovating it for his family. I would live out the winter in that property without heat or most basic amenities. I chose to be alone and miserable rather than show myself to others. I was sick more times that winter than I have ever been in my life. Not once did I consider reaching out for safe housing or a place to land. Shame carves deep scars in people who have endured psychological abuse, myself included. In fact, I didn't even acknowledge what had happened to me was abuse. That word in itself is filled with shame. Using it feels like you are invoking something bigger than yourself. Calling it abuse felt like I was making a big deal out of the situation, making excuses for myself, asking for attention I didn't deserve. I told myself other people had endured so much worse than I had. I told myself it wasn't that bad. I was ashamed of the abuse, but I was also ashamed to think of myself as a victim. Shame is not easily shaken off. In fact, it can affect the core perception of ourselves and our identity. People who have experienced traumatic events may rewrite their self-perception to include feelings of disgust and humiliation, as well as negative comparisons of themselves with other people. Acute chronic shame can erode self-esteem in ongoing and destructive ways. Even now, I cannot banish the shame. As survivors of emotional abuse, the language of shame perfectly echoes the language used by our abusers. It tells us what they told us, that no one will believe us, that we aren't worthy of support and compassion, that we aren't just people who make mistakes, but rather that we are, at our very core, mistakes in and of ourselves. Shame tells you that, if you are truly seen, the world will judge you as harshly as you judge yourself. It tells you that you are unworthy of acceptance and belonging. It tells you lies. And even knowing what a liar shame is, I still fear the effects of allowing this part of myself to be seen. End of quotation of that extract, but the full article is listed in the reference sources. Our next section, the false perception of neutrality in institutions, law, media, and monarchy. Another extract from an article that is listed and detailed in full in the references. The abstract begins. Coercive control is harmful behaviour recently criminalised in England and Wales. The extent to which the work of practitioners is informed by an understanding of coercive control, therefore, requires investigation. Using data from 2 mixed methods multi-site studies, this article suggests that practitioners' recognition of coercive control does not seem to be universally poor or skilled, but rather depends on the characteristics of the situation itself, the organisational context in which practitioners work, and the stage at which they are evaluating whether coercive control is present. The absence of a clear understanding of the importance of coercive control when making judgments about victims and perpetrators has serious implications for the efficacy of current approaches to domestic abuse. Purposeful and systematic efforts to support practitioners to recognise and respond effectively to coercive control are required. End of that particular abstract quote. Here is another. Coercive control is characterised by negative behaviours which intimidate, threaten, and humiliate a person or restrict a person's liberty. In addition to being a known risk factor for experiencing other forms of violence, research has linked coercive control to symptoms of psychological distress and suicidality. In the UK, coercive and controlling behaviours within intimate and familial relationships have been legislated as offending behaviours. However, there still exists a lack of international evidence on wider public knowledge and understanding of coercive control. The Northern Ireland Life and Time Survey is an annual cross-sectional representative survey of social policy topics. Participants are adults aged 18 years or over. Concerning coercive control, respondents were presented with two relationship scenarios: obvious and less obvious coercive control. Following each scenario, respondents indicated their level of agreement to 10 statements covering attitudes towards coercive control, victims of coercive control, talking about coercive control, and whether coercive control is a crime. Respondents indicated whether they had heard of the term coercive control. Predictors of coercive control awareness were assessed using multinomial logistic regression. Mixed analysis of variance assessed if agreement levels to the 10 statements varied by type of coercive control and victim gender. Most respondents said they had heard of the term coercive control and knew what it meant. Those who had not heard of coercive control at all were more likely to be on a lower income, less qualified, and younger, when compared to those who said they knew what the term meant. Significant interactions between coercive control type and victim gender were evident for all 10 statements. While most respondents are aware of the term coercive control, a significant number have not and are therefore unlikely to recognise the signs of this type of abuse. Next heading: Survivors of coercive control abuse, an invisible architects of their own escape. When we think of abuse, we often picture physical violence, but some of the most damaging forms of abuse leave no bruises. Coercive control is a pattern of behaviour that strips away a person's autonomy, safety, and sense of self, often long before they realise what's happening. It is subtle, manipulative, and deeply psychological. As one person said in this section, and furthermore in the report, in the reference sources, the person said, "As a trauma therapist, I've worked with countless survivors who blame themselves for overreacting, when in truth they were trapped in a dynamic designed to confuse and control them. With the right support, including online therapy and tools like EMDR, healing and freedom are possible." What is coercive control? Coercive control is a form of emotional and psychological abuse that uses manipulation, isolation, intimidation, and gaslighting to dominate another person. It's often present in domestic violence relationships, but can also show up in family dynamics, workplaces, and spiritual communities. It can look like, and there are a series of bullet points here: controlling what you wear, eat, or who you see; monitoring your phone, email, or social media; constant criticism or demeaning comments; making you doubt your memory or sanity, which is gaslighting; financial control; restricting access to money or demanding full transparency; threats to harm you, your reputation, or loved ones if you leave; making you feel like you are the abuser when you express distress; Why? It's hard to see. Because coercive control doesn't leave physical scars, many survivors struggle to name it as abuse. Abusers often frame their behaviour as love, protection, or concern, making victims feel guilty or ungrateful for questioning it. This next section was an article written on the 8th of September 2024 by Samara Knight, and its heading is What Coercive Control Looks Like, 20 Real-Life Examples from Victims. Coercive control is often subtle and insidious, making it difficult for victims to recognise and explain to others. Unlike overt physical abuse, coercive control slowly chips away at a person's sense of self through emotional manipulation, isolation, and the erosion of personal freedoms. Victims often feel trapped in a web of rules that shift and change, making it impossible to predict what will set their abuser off. Coercive control in daily life. Coercive control takes many forms, limiting freedom of movement, monitoring communications, financial control, and undermining self-worth. Over time, victims lose not only their autonomy, but also their identity. Here, survivors of coercive control share their personal experiences, offering insight into what coercive control really looks like and how this form of abuse can affect every facet of life. 1. Undermining my confidence. He would scream in my face until I couldn't argue back anymore. Then, if I made a minor mistake, like folding a towel the wrong way, he'd explode, calling me an awful person. No apology was ever good enough for him, and I eventually stopped standing up for myself. 2. Mocking my interests. It was easier to let him watch whatever he wanted. If he tried to watch my shows, he'd make fun of them or talk over them. Over time, I just gave in to avoid the conflict. 3. Controlling my appearance. He told me to wear my hair. He told me how to wear my hair, and that I shouldn't wear short clothes because other people shouldn't see my body. It got to the point where I couldn't even go out with friends without him making a comment. 4. Emotional blackmail. Whenever I needed something or wanted to discuss an issue in our relationship, he threatened to kill himself. It became impossible to communicate, and I always ended up feeling like it was my fault. 5. Accusations and surveillance. Despite working from home and being with him almost all the time, he would constantly accuse me of cheating. I'd show him my phone, and he'd refuse to look. He wanted to believe I was guilty, regardless of the truth. 6. Gaslighting. My reality. He claimed all his actions were out of concern for my well-being, but it felt like he was controlling every aspect of my life. I began to lose my sense of reality, unsure if I was the problem or if he was manipulating me. 7. Subtle emotional digs. It wasn't outright abuse, but small comments that slowly chipped away at my self-esteem. These jokes, in inverted commas, weren't funny. They were domestic abuse, disguised as humour. 8. Silent surrender. He rarely told me outright, "You're not allowed to do this," but the shaming, fights and depressive episodes from him that followed made doing anything hardly worth it. I stifled myself dramatically just to avoid conflict. I stopped seeing friends and family, stopped wearing nail polish, stopped running, stopped doing hobbies that didn't make money, stopped dressing up, stopped washing my hair regularly, and stopped baking. All these simple things that most people take for granted, I avoided them just to escape his inevitable reaction. 9. Sex and financial control. He used sex as a weapon, withholding it when he was angry or using it to punish me. On top of that, he controlled all the finances, leaving me with no options. 10. Public shaming. In front of family and friends, he'd belittle me, call me a servant, and criticise my cooking. It was constant humiliation, but I felt trapped because I had no escape. 11. No right choice. I had a pair of jeans that fit me perfectly and were similar to what other moms wore, but every time I put them on, my husband called me a whore and worse. I eventually threw them away, but when he found them, he made a big deal about taking them back, only for the cycle to repeat when I wore them again. It was constant pattern of shame and manipulation. 12. Jealousy about male friends. I was told in the very beginning that I should not have male friends. He would get mad if I ran into old high school male friends or mentioned a male friend I had known for years. One time, he even moved my chair away from a guy I was sitting next to during a game night with friends because he said I was too close. 13. Dictating my looks. At first, he complimented me, saying I didn't need makeup or hair dye, but that evolved into forbidding me from using them altogether because he wanted me to look worse than him. 14. Constantly changing the rules. Every time I started to feel in control of my life, he'd change the rules. It felt like I was always back at square one, questioning everything I did. 15. Discouraging my independence. He discouraged me from applying for jobs, claiming he didn't want me working with other men. He even controlled my finances, even though I paid most of the bills. 16. Constant criticism. I did more than my share of the household chores, but every time I mentioned it, I was told, "It's not a competition." He constantly criticised my work, watching over my shoulder, even for tasks I'd done my whole life. After a 12-hour workday, I'd finally sit down, only to be asked why I was resting, as if my exhaustion didn't matter. Meanwhile, he'd sit after working less hours, but his complaints never stopped. It felt like no matter what I did, it was never enough. 17. Undermining my self-worth. He manipulated everyone around me, including our children, to believe that I was at fault, It felt impossible to escape his control because he isolated me from any support. 18. Explosive reactions. I was nursing my baby on the couch when my partner got up from bed and started screaming at me because I hadn't cleared my cereal bowl from the table. He didn't seem to understand that my baby was the priority at that moment, not tidying up. 19. Invasion of privacy. I wasn't allowed to lock the bathroom door or take time to myself without him barging in, questioning why I needed privacy. If I ever locked the door, he'd make a big scene, saying it was strange or suspicious. He would even find tools to unlock it from the outside, claiming he had to use the bathroom, even though there were other toilets in the house. I wasn't allowed any peace, and he always found a way to disrupt even my quiet moments. 20. Body shaming. He would not let me try a dress on in a store, and he told me in front of the salesperson how my body is not in good enough shape to try on that dress. It was a maxi dress and would have been fine, but nope. It was the same when I attempted to buy chocolate. He had me return it as though I was a kid. And well done to those 20 people who were able to talk about it and give examples to help others. Next section. How coercive control takes over lives. These stories illustrate what coercive control looks like in seemingly small, everyday actions that add up to a life ruled by fear and manipulation. Victims of this type of abuse often find themselves constantly second-guessing their actions and bending to their abuser's will just to keep the peace. One of the most damaging aspects of coercive control is how it gradually takes over a person's life, isolating them from friends, family, and even their own sense of identity. It can take years for victims to recognize the patterns of control, by which time they may have lost confidence in their ability to make decisions or even know who they are outside of that relationship. For those experiencing coercive control, it's important to recognize that these behaviours are forms of domestic abuse, even if they don't involve physical violence. Emotional and psychological control can be just as devastating, and seeking help is a crucial step in breaking free from the cycle. By sharing their experiences, these survivors shed light on the reality of coercive control, helping others recognize the signs and empowering them to take the first step towards regaining their independence. Over the next 6 weeks, we will be building on this foundation of information around coercive control as being part of domestic abuse, domestic violence. There will also be, how can I put it, there'll be examples of events, things that have been done by individuals or groups, and I'm hoping that over the 6 weeks you will start to make cross-reference and say, that happened to so-and-so, that happened to this person, this is what this group did. And I will be using as part of the notoriety, so that when I quote a particular group of people or an individual, you will, one, know who I'm talking about. And when I quote something or things that it will be more than one thing over the 6 weeks, things that they have done to others. I use Meghan as an example, and Harry, and other people will be cropping up as well in these coming weeks. But the reason for that is, one, they're high profile, so you'll know who I'm talking about. You'll most likely remember the incident or things that I'm going to explain, relate, or remind you of from over the years, things that have been done, either by Royal Rota, either by one or more of the Rota, all of them if they've agreed, because you can tell by newspaper articles when they've agreed a particular direction of travel and the style and content of what they're going to be writing about, even if they don't all write them on the same day, although many of them do. In that week, you will see a pattern emerging of what they're trying to do. And even though, in the case of the Sussexes, they're not even on the same continent, but because there's so little interest in the rest of the royal family, and certainly very little income compared to what they were earning when they were chasing down the Sussexes, now they have transferred their abuse across borders, hence the title of my book. And they still put their tentacles out and try and use coercive control, psychological abuse to damage, to harm. And when they feel that they've done that for a little while, let's swap it round a bit, they will then try and damage their reputation by bringing out articles and their regular sessions on YouTube where they like to interview one another. It's quite embarrassing, really, the desperation that must exist to put food on their table. So they talk to one another, and then they sort of go and interview individuals who need a check of some kind. And those people will then, over a number of interviews with different media formats, will do it and try, in that degradation, to try and ruin the reputation of Harry or Meghan. Usually Meghan, but Harry's a close second. And they do it for income. And they do it because they have to have someone to hate. That's how their life speaks volumes, really. So just to go back to that, I will be referring to media, TV media, printed media, online media, and the groups that I'll be looking at, as I said, are Royal Rota, newspaper barons, and the way that they direct their underlings to do various things, because ultimately royal reporters, they will discover, are cannon fodder. No newspaper baron is going to go to prison for anything or even be accused of anything, but the people that work for those papers will one day. Even if it's one or two, it'll be enough to really cause them some concern. And also the monarchy. And when I tell you that I went back, obviously using history books, wasn't able to really go into great detail over 1,000 years, but I found more than enough cases, acts of violence, called different things in those times, but just the descriptions of what they did refer to coercive control. And when you have that kind of evidence, and you come up to date where there definitely is evidence and it is using the terminology that is understood, you realise there is a pattern, particularly within UK monarchy, of how they treat women and how they treat children and call it something else. Duty is one of the favourite words that they like to use. But if you did that to a working class child living outside of palace gates, it wouldn't be described in any positive way, and it certainly wouldn't be referred to as duty. Anything but. And that is why the equivalent of children protection services in any country will always go to the working class within their nation and leave the wealthy and elite as being untouchable. Hence why a number of things occur in those kind of circles that we're never going to hear about, or if we do, it's not going to be commented on by anybody and certainly not the media, because they want to keep their job. But just to explain that there are things that you probably won't have thought of that have taken place even in the last 50, 60 years, and that are recorded, even if you weren't born around that time, you will see that they are sort of in publications, things have been written, and it's quite shocking what has gone on and who's been allowed to walk away and who has been apprehended. So yeah, that's probably without me sort of giving much more away. That's the kind of thing that we're going to be looking at over the 6 weeks, and in some cases you will realise that it links to some of the episodes in the previous 2 mini-series, like things around safeguarding and things that if you were working in a different environment you would have protections in place, and if things were happening that shouldn't be happening you could take action. But if you regard the royal family as the firm, you would expect, as I said in those earlier podcasts, safeguarding should be part of it. It isn't, and therefore the types of things and behaviours and practices that go on between staff and the firm, the management of it, wouldn't be allowed elsewhere without challenge. And this 6 weeks is about widening the scope and understanding of what constitutes coercive control, what constitutes abuse generally, and how we need to have more discussions about that, spread and educate people nationally, because it's not just England, we're looking at an international approach here. And further down the line, months down the line, you will see there are, how can we put it, there's a framework for that to happen in a variety of countries, but all come together under this umbrella. So I'll leave it at that for now. So this was just an opening, a foundation. Different things will crop up that we will repeat over the coming weeks in different episodes. But by the end of the 6 weeks, I'm hoping that you have a framework that you can picture in your mind. And when certain events happen, start to look for, has it happened before? If so, to whom, where, how? And you'd be amazed at the patterns and trends that emerge that you can track back over time. And my 8 years of the research for this forthcoming publication is around that, because the majority of those 8 years was doing that type of thing. Doing research, going right back, looking at what has been published, and then trying to interpret and read between the lines of what was being discussed here. Very interesting, very time consuming. And then when you put it with case law and make comparisons with modern day case law and what went on decades, centuries in some cases before, it's a lot. But it's a lot of data and it's there for a reason. Not to mention receipts that all squad have got. That's just gold, because there's no other movement that I know of that has been so meticulous in how we record receipts. So that's all I'm going to say about that. I'm not going to keep labouring about future publications. There will be the odd flyer that comes out that's part of the publication, but I'm not going to say too much. I don't want to bore people with it. But just know that those 8 years have not been wasted, and that things are going to be interesting in the coming years. It matters not whether I'm here to see all of it. The point is that the process has started. It has already started, and it definitely is going to kick in even more soon. So, thank you very much for listening to the first of a series of 6. Hope you have found it useful. I hope that you keep it, save it as a record together with the reference sources, because over the coming weeks and months and years, I think you are going to find all of the podcasts very, very useful indeed. Let me just say that every podcast that I have published over the years with this channel has been part of the research for the book. So you'll just sort of think then of some of those episodes, and then in the future, you will start to see the linkages and think, that's what that podcast was about, or that's what those podcasts were about. And that's the modern bit, sort of, I'm hoping, even if some of them were a bit dry, there was a reason for them. There's a reason for them to be documented, and there is a reason that they are part of an evidence base. So, that's just episode 1 of 6. Hopefully, I've got you thinking now about what's coming up over this series, over the weeks and months, because of the international part of it, and certainly over a few years. So for now, it's bye from me, bye from Ivy, bye.